Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we are going to be exploring the idea of moral injury.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah, so, it's that sense of, like, violating your own moral code.
Right.
And we've got some excerpts here from a psychology article about, the impacts of that and the psychological and even neurological impacts of moral injury.
I think you'll find this one to be very interesting.
Okay.
It really shines a light on how moral injury differs from PTSD and the unique challenges that it presents.
Okay, well, let's jump right in to really illustrate this. We've got this story of David Peters, a 19-year-old Marine who was involved in a car accident, and he accidentally killed a woman in this accident.
Yeah, his story is really powerful because even though the accident wasn't his fault,
Right.
David carried with him this immense guilt and shame for years.
Yeah.
And, he even resorted to some reckless behavior, almost as if he was seeking punishment.
Yeah, it said that he bought a motorcycle thinking that, like, dying in a similar accident would be some kind of, like, justice.
Wow.
It's a stark look at how, this moral injury can impact someone.
Really is. And it highlights what we call moral injury.
Okay.
It's a term that was first coined by psychiatrist Jonathan Shea.
Mm-hmm.
And he initially defined it in the context of the military.
Okay.
And he was really focused on this sense of betrayal that soldiers felt from authority figures.
So, like, if a soldier was ordered to do something that really clashed with their own, like, personal ethics or morals,
Exactly.
that would be like a form of moral injury, potentially.
Yeah, and that was the initial definition.
Okay.
But it has broadened over time. Researchers like Brett Litz have recognized that moral injury can also stem from, like, personal transgressions.
Oh, okay.
And it can even occur outside of, just the battlefield.
Wow. Okay, so it's not just limited to veterans.
Right.
I mean, that really expands the scope of who could be affected by this.
Yeah.
So I'm curious then, how would we differentiate moral injury from PTSD?
Right.
They both seem to be linked to trauma in some way.
They are, and that's a really crucial distinction.
Sure.
While both can arise from trauma, the core difference lies in the moral dimension.
Okay.
So PTSD often stems from, experiencing a physical threat like a natural disaster or something.
Okay.
But moral injury always involves this perceived violation of one's own moral code, even if there's no physical harm.
Okay, so let me see if I understand that.
Yeah.
So somebody who is, in a natural disaster might develop PTSD because of, the life-threatening nature of that event.
Right.
But not necessarily moral injury because it doesn't violate, their moral code.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. What about the symptoms, though? Aren't they similar?
They can overlap.
Okay.
So both PTSD and moral injury can involve, flashbacks, nightmares, avoidance behaviors.
Right.
But moral injury uniquely leads to this profound loss of self-worth, meaning, and even faith. It's like their moral compass has been shattered.
Yeah, that's heavy stuff.
It is.
The article actually mentions a 2016 study showing different brain activity patterns in those with moral injury versus PTSD.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about these neurological differences?
This is a fascinating study.
Okay.
It really suggests that the brain processes these experiences very differently. Individuals with moral injury showed altered activity in specific areas that are associated with, like, self-referential processing and moral reasoning.
Okay.
And so this kind of indicates that moral injury might have a unique impact on, how we see ourselves and our place in the world.
Okay, so we've established that moral injury can affect anyone.
Yeah.
It's not just veterans.
Right.
So what are some examples of how this might play out in everyday life?
Well, the research offers some really compelling examples.
Okay.
Consider teachers in underprivileged schools. They're dedicated to their students, but oftentimes, the lack of resources and support can create this sense of helplessness.
Right.
And they're forced to compromise their moral commitment to their students' well-being.
Okay.
Because of the systemic limitations.
So it's not just about witnessing something morally wrong.
Right.
It's also about feeling unable to act according to your own values.
Exactly. Another example is healthcare workers during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Oh, yeah.
They faced, these agonizing choices. They had to ration care. They witnessed immense suffering.
Yeah.
And many of them felt unable to provide the level of care that they were trained to give.
Right.
And this led to significant moral distress.
It's like they were forced to compromise, their oath as healers due to the circumstances.
Exactly.
Yeah, that must have been incredibly difficult.
It was.
So how can we differentiate between everyday moral stress that we all kind of experience and something that is, more serious that requires intervention?
That's where the idea of a moral continuum comes in.
Okay.
It's a spectrum with, everyday anxieties on one end and the truly debilitating effects of moral injury on the other.
Right.
So you might feel some moral stress about an upcoming election, but it's probably not going to keep you up at night.
Right. You're not going to be losing sleep over it.
Yeah, exactly.
But a personal betrayal or, a decision that seriously harms another person.
Yeah.
That's a different level.
That's different.
From moral distress.
Exactly. And it's important to note that, not everyone who experiences a potentially morally injurious event will develop moral injury.
Right.
It's individual moral frameworks and coping mechanisms play a significant role in that.
So if moral injury is so subjective, how do researchers even measure it?
That is a great question, and it's been a challenge for researchers.
Okay.
There's no simple, blood test or brain scan.
Yeah.
But Brett Litz and his colleagues developed a 14-item scale to assess moral injury. And that represents significant progress in the diagnosis and research.
Okay.
It helps us identify those who might be struggling and to measure the severity of their distress.
So we're moving towards a better understanding of moral injury.
Right.
That's good.
It is.
What about treatment, though? Can therapies that are used for PTSD be applied to moral injury?
That's where things get a little tricky.
Okay.
Traditional PTSD therapies often focus on reframing the traumatic event.
Okay.
Helping individuals process the fear and anxiety associated with it. But with moral injury, the event itself might be a genuine moral transgression.
Right.
So simply reframing it might not be ethical or even helpful.
You can't just tell somebody to think differently about something that they perceive as deeply wrong.
Exactly.
So what kind of therapies are proving effective then?
One promising approach is called adaptive disclosure.
Okay.
And this takes a forward-looking perspective. So instead of dwelling on the past, it encourages individuals to take ownership of their actions, work towards self-forgiveness, and find ways to make amends.
So it's about shifting the focus from self-condemnation to future contributions.
Exactly.
Okay, that sounds really empowering.
It is. It's about recognizing that even though a moral transgression occurred, individuals can still lead meaningful lives.
Right.
And make positive contributions.
So I'm curious, how might these reparative actions look in practice? What are some examples?
Reparative actions can take many forms.
Okay.
It really depends on the individual and the nature of the transgression. So it could involve apologizing to someone they harmed.
Okay.
It could be volunteering for a cause that's related to the transgression.
Right.
Or engaging in advocacy work to prevent similar harm from happening to others.
Okay.
The key is to find actions that align with their values and contribute to healing and restoration.
Yeah, so finding a way to make things right, to kind of balance the scales a little bit.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, that's really interesting. So it seems like there's also this spiritual dimension to moral injury and its healing. Is that something that researchers are exploring?
You're absolutely right. There's a growing recognition of that spiritual aspect.
Okay.
Harold Koenig, a psychiatrist at Duke University, has been researching these spiritually integrated therapies for moral injury.
Interesting.
And these therapies often draw on, religious traditions and incorporate practice like confession and seeking absolution.
Okay.
They offer this path to redemption and healing that resonates deeply with a lot of people.
So even if someone isn't particularly religious, just those core principles of seeking forgiveness and making amends can be incredibly therapeutic.
Precisely. It taps into this universal human need for reconciliation and a sense of restoration.
Okay.
It's about acknowledging wrongdoing and taking steps to right the wrong, even if it can't be fully undone.
Right. And remember David Peters? The Marine we were talking about earlier.
Yes.
He found solace in this concept of a city of refuge.
Yes, he did.
That idea from the Old Testament where, someone who accidentally committed a crime could go to this place to seek sanctuary.
Exactly. And it provided this safe space for reflection, atonement, and ultimately reintegration back into society. And, David created his own kind of metaphorical city of refuge.
Okay.
Through art and community.
Wow.
And his work to reduce car dependency.
So he took something, so painful.
Yes.
And turned it into something positive.
Exactly. He channeled that guilt and shame into something positive and meaningful.
It's really inspiring.
It is.
It shows that, healing is possible.
It is.
But it requires this multifaceted approach.
Yes.
That addresses the psychological, the social, and the spiritual dimensions.
You got it.
I mean, there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
But research is giving us, valuable tools and insights.
Yeah.
This deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening. Moral injury is far more complex than simple guilt or shame.
It is.
It can impact anyone, not just veterans.
Right.
And the effects can be really profound and long-lasting.
They can.
So, where do we go from here?
Well, I think the research is really making significant strides in understanding, measuring, and treating it.
That's good.
The development of, therapies like adaptive disclosure and the integration of spiritual practices are particularly encouraging.
So it seems like traditional approaches to trauma therapy might not be enough.
No, they're not.
To address the unique challenges of moral injury.
Exactly.
So what do we need?
Well, we need to recognize that moral injury requires these specialized therapies that acknowledge the ethical dimensions of the experience and empower individuals to move forward with a sense of purpose and restored self-worth.
Okay.
It's about helping them rebuild their moral compass and find a path towards healing and wholeness.
This has been a very, heavy but really important conversation.
Yeah.
So what does all of this mean for us?
Right.
How can understanding moral injury change our perspectives on, individual struggles and societal issues?
That's the question, isn't it?
It is a big one.
It challenges us to look beyond the surface.
Okay.
And consider, the moral dilemmas that people might be facing. It encourages empathy and understanding.
Oh.
So instead of judging, we can try to understand, the complex moral landscape that might have shaped their actions and their reactions.
So it's a call to move beyond judgment.
Yes.
And offer support, understanding, and resources for healing.
Absolutely.
It's to recognize that people can make mistakes and, experience deep regret.
Right.
And still deserve compassion and a chance at redemption.
I agree.
So, thinking about healthcare workers who are struggling with burnout and moral distress.
Yes.
Teachers facing impossible choices in under-resourced schools. Or, even just individuals carrying the burden of past mistakes. Understanding moral injury can help us approach these situations with more sensitivity and a willingness to support their healing journeys.
Exactly. And it prompts us to consider, the systems and structures that contribute to moral injury.
Because it's not always a purely individual issue.
No, it's not.
It can, reflect these systemic problems, ethical dilemmas within institutions, or societal norms that contradict personal values.
Absolutely.
So understanding moral injury can be this catalyst for broader conversations about ethics, responsibility, social change.
I agree.
So it's not just about treating individual cases. It's about examining our own moral compasses and considering the potential consequences of our actions and working towards creating a world where individuals feel supported in upholding their values and making ethical choices.
I couldn't agree more.
It's about fostering a culture of ethical awareness. Where people feel empowered to speak up about moral concerns.
Absolutely.
And work together to create these, more just and compassionate systems.
Yes.
We've really gone deep on this one.
We have.
Moral injury is such a, multifaceted issue with far-reaching implications. And it's a call to action for us to be more aware, more empathetic, and more proactive in supporting those who are struggling.
Yes.
While also working towards, a more ethical and compassionate world.
Absolutely. It's a journey of individual healing and collective growth, recognizing the profound impact of moral transgressions and creating space for redemption, restoration, and positive change.
This has been such an insightful look into moral injury.
It really has.
We've explored its distinction from PTSD, the different ways it can show up,
right,
and even those promising therapies that are starting to emerge to address it.
Yeah.
But I still feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
Well, that's the beauty of it all.
Yeah.
There's always more to explore.
Yeah.
We've given, a foundation for understanding moral injury.
Right.
But now it's your turn.
Okay. Yeah.
How can you apply this knowledge?
Yeah, how can we take this and actually use it?
Right. Maybe engage in some meaningful conversations about it.
Yeah.
I wonder how it might, shift your perspectives on the world around you.
That's a great point. It's not just about, absorbing the information. It's about what we do with it.
Exactly.
How can we let this change the way we interact with others?
Yeah.
The way we approach tough situations or even advocate for change.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think it starts with awareness.
Okay.
Recognizing that moral injury exists
Mm-hmm.
and that it can affect anyone.
Yeah.
And that it has, profound consequences.
Right.
Once we're aware, we can start to look for signs of it.
Okay.
In ourselves and in others.
Yeah.
Maybe someone is struggling with guilt and shame.
Mm-hmm.
That seems out of proportion
Okay.
to this situation.
Right.
Or perhaps they're withdrawing from people, losing their sense of purpose.
Yeah.
Or engaging in self-destructive behaviors.
Right. Those could all be signs.
Or it could be indicators, yeah.
So recognizing the signs is that first step.
Then
what can we do to support someone who might be experiencing this?
Well, the most important thing is to create a safe and non-judgmental space
Okay.
for them to share their experiences.
Yeah.
Listen with empathy.
Mm-hmm.
Validate their feelings.
Right.
Let them know that they're not alone.
Yeah.
And that what they're going through is understandable.
Mm-hmm.
Given what they've experienced.
Given their experience. Yeah.
Avoid offering, simplistic solutions.
Right.
Or minimizing their pain.
Okay.
Instead, focus on creating that supportive environment where they feel heard and respected and empowered to seek help.
So it sounds like it's more about just being present.
Yeah, it is.
And offering support than, trying to fix the problem.
Right.
What about professional help?
Mm-hmm.
What resources are out there for people?
Well, there are a growing number of therapists who specialize in moral injury treatment.
Okay.
Look for therapists who are trained in trauma-informed care and have experience working with moral injuries specifically.
Okay.
Organizations like the Moral Injury Project and the Veterans Administration offer resources and support for individuals and families.
Okay.
And there are also online support groups and communities where people can connect with others who understand what they're going through.
So the resources are out there.
They are.
It's just about, knowing where to look and having the courage to ask for help.
Exactly.
Any final thoughts for our listeners as we wrap up this deep dive?
Well, I think understanding moral injury is an invitation to cultivate greater compassion and understanding in ourselves and in the world around us. It's about you recognizing the complexities of human experience and creating space for healing and growth and transformation.
Absolutely.
As you navigate your own life and interact with others. Keep this concept of moral injury in mind.
Okay.
It might just change the way you see the world and inspire you to make it a more compassionate and just place.
Wonderful. Well said. This has been a very thought-provoking deep dive.
It has.
And I hope it inspires our listeners to, continue to explore this important topic.
Me too.
Until next time, stay curious.